Thank you very much. So, as said, my name's Adam Cohen. My pronouns are he, him, and my co-presenter.
Hi, I'm Jules Guzman. I use they, them pronouns.
Yeah, and today we'll be talking to you about the project we undertook at the Mount Royal University Library in order to implement the Homosaurus vocabulary in our catalog to make materials by, for, and about queer people more accessible to them. So first, I would just like to start by saying that I am a grateful settler living in the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy. It's made up of the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Tsuut'ina, the Yahe Nakoda nations, the Métis Nation of Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. I strive to be an ally working towards healing and decolonization.
And I am situated on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory on the island of Tiohtià:ke, colonially known as Montreal. It is the traditional gathering place of many First Nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe. I stand in solidarity with Land Back and support Indigenous sovereignty and decolonization.
So just as an overview for our presentation, we're going to talk about why we undertook this project, as well as some of the theoretical underpinnings of our approach. We'll give a quick rundown of what we actually did during the project. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with some of what we learned so that this project can be possibly reproduced at your own institutions.
So firstly, some background on why we started the project. We started the project to make the library and its catalog a more inclusive space to navigate, creating welcoming and validating space for queer and trans communities. We wanted to move away from outdated terminology in the catalog, moving away from terms that are harmful and towards a more inclusive and widely used terminology like the terms queer and trans. So much information on queer and trans knowledge and histories get lost without proper access points and vocabulary to describe sources. So we wanted to create further access points to queer and trans knowledge to facilitate and nurture more trans and queer research by the community. And we want to do this by updating the metadata with Homosaurus subject headings to supplement LCSH, creating further access points. So,
from what Jules said, and as well as a lot of other issues in the sort of cataloging profession, kind of as a reaction to these issues and the shortcomings of the traditional method of cataloging utilized by most libraries in the West, critical cataloging has developed alongside library technical services for almost a century, being known by many different terms, such as radical or reformative cataloging, and most recently being known as critical cataloging. So critical cataloging, which is one of the kind of theoretical underpinnings of our approach, is a form of critical scholarship that utilizes critical practices along with social justice theory to address areas of inequality, specifically in cataloging practice and standards. The critical cataloging movement has sought to address issues such as authorities, classification, and the topic of today's presentation, subject terminology. Regarding our specific topic of queer subjects in the library, work is being done to fill in those gaps. So projects such as the Trans Metadata Collective's metadata best practices for trans and gender diverse resources, as well as implementations of variant subject vocabularies have all strongly inspired our own work. So speaking of variant vocabularies and terminology, that brings us to the topic of today's presentation, which is Homosaurus. Homosaurus is, from their own website, an international linked data vocabulary of terms to describe resources by, for, and about queer people. It recognizes the gap in LCSH, so it is a supplement and not meant to replace it. So as a fun fact, Homosaurus was first started all the way back in 1997 as a standalone Dutch and English vocabulary. It wasn't as formalized back then. And so this version 0 was later updated in 2013 into a more recognizable version of the vocabulary. It's just interesting to see that a recognized need for this has been seen all the way back since 1997. So now we'll just talk a little bit about the project itself. So the main goal for this project, taken directly from our project proposal, was to improve and enhance the discoverability of 2S LGBTQIA+ materials in our library via review and metadata updating. It was an opportunity to remove and replace outdated metadata and terminology, while ultimately better highlighting relevant resources in a manner that is accurate and respectfully represents queer scholarship, content, perspectives, and history, and resonates and reflects the diverse community for which those materials are by, for, and about. So from the outside, this project seems quite massive, so it was really important for us to scope it in a way that allowed us to make an actual dent in the collection, but also allowing ourselves to devote the necessary time to each item in order to properly and respectfully describe their subjects. So with that in mind, we decided to scope our project on two parameters. First, we limited ourselves to only physical materials. This was done because we know that we have 100% control over those records. As an Alma and Primo institution, we utilize the community zone to easily integrate larger electronic resource packages into our catalog. And for anyone unaware, the community or how the community zone works, the important point is that the catalog records for these items are managed by Ex Libris and not MRU. So while this allows us to take a hands-off approach managing certain collections, it also means that unless we want to lose that functionality, we can't make lasting changes to a number of our electronic resource catalog records. Secondly, we had to actually try and identify items that needed remediation. One option for this would have been to use subject headings, but the issue with this is largely due to the reasons for starting this project. Historically relevant subject headings have been misapplied or just plain left out of queer library materials. So this had the possibility of missing a large number of resources, and that information would just continue to be invisible to the community. So we made the decision to instead use the Library of Congress classification numbers for these. This was because they have been more consistently applied, although there are still issues with LCC and queer subjects. And we can guarantee that all the physical books in our collection will have a call number, so we can grab as much as we possibly can. This also compares with what other institutions have done. Emory University did an automated Homosaurus project, and they chose similar ranges. So the call number ranges that we chose were BF 692 to 692.52, which deals with sexual behavior under psychology, and then HQ 18.5 to 449, which is about human sexuality and sex. So the items pulled from these ranges, along with the addition of materials from our 2S LGBTQIA+ collection, we were able to identify over 1,000 titles in need of remediation. Now 1,000 titles is a lot. And if you work in technical services, you probably already know that we barely have time to catalog new books, let alone update the records of over 1,000 titles, no matter how important the work is. So that's where my co-presenter comes in. We're able to convince library administration that we needed to hire a student to come in and work through these titles. We didn't want to just hire any student, though. We want to hire a student with the background knowledge and lived experience to best understand the materials and what they're about. Jules also did not have a library background at the time, so they were able to approach this project from sort of outside the Western cataloging zeitgeist. And now, so I'm just going to give Jules an opportunity to talk a bit about their experience.
Okay, so here is an overview of what I'll be highlighting from my experience cataloging the over 1,000 books over the span of about 6 months. And I worked on the Homosaurus project while I was completing my bachelor's of sociology at MRU. So yeah, here is what I encountered in terms of trends and things that stuck out to me. So firstly, I noticed huge gaps with the LCSH. So LCSH shows extreme gaps for access points. For example, LCSH acknowledges queer and non-binary as variants, but these are presented to the user under sexual minorities, which is a term I came across a lot. This photo is a screenshot of my project tracking sheet and illustrates the lack of equivalence between Homosaurus terms and LCSH. So you can see here that any terms that include the term queer are not in the LCSH, such as queer people of color, queer history, queer literature, and also the term trans. So this leads me to my next point, where LCSH is inadequate in capturing queer and trans experiences. So as seen in this example, this record had the term LCSH term sex change, which was found, which translates to many terms in the Homosaurus, such as gender affirming surgery, transitioning gender, bottom surgery, top surgery, hormone replacement therapy, and even more. Sex change is then an insufficient term to describe the variety of trans experiences and reinforces and recreates oppressive gender binaries. Homosaurus vocabulary extends itself to the plethora of trans and queer experiences and is informed by the spectrum and fluidity of gender and sexuality, rather than being limited to binaries. I think this allows for Homosaurus terms to aid deconstruct oppressive systems such as gender binaries. And so another thing I noticed is that in my project is that Homosaurus terms can illustrate transphobia and homophobia in the catalog. So in part of deconstructing oppressive systems, Homosaurus terms can illustrate harmful and exclusionary texts to library users. This example of Gender Hurts by Sheila Jeffries shows the use of Homosaurus subject headings to specify ideologies that shape the source, including the terms trans exclusionary feminism, trans exclusionary feminist, transphobia, and gender identity disorder. So when library users encounter this text, they can see it is shaped by transphobic attitudes, and this allows for a more reparative approach and experience for library users and catalogers. Here's another example of applying Homosaurus terms to exclusionary/harmful materials versus community and ally written materials. As you can see, I applied terms such as medicalization, disorders of sexual development, transgenderism, and trans exclusivity to illustrate the transphobic ideas proposed in the book on the left. And on the right, non-binary children, gender creative, gender non-conforming people, and transgender identity supplement the LCSH terms transgender children. While I was cataloging, I did notice, and while I was tracking everything, I also kept note of possible terms to propose to Homosaurus. So there are gaps in the Homosaurus, but here's an image of the list that I ended up compiling and ended up sending to Homosaurus through the contact page, easily accessible on the website. It was very easy to use, and the editorial board actually replied right away, like the next day, asking for further notes and suggestions on the terms I proposed. So to me, this confirms the feeling that Homosaurus is for and by queer and trans community members, with its vocabulary shaped by its users. In line with community efforts is my next point. In part of this project being oriented towards community, being part of this project allowed me to feel seen as a community member. I learned new terms and language to understand my queerness as a non-binary Filipinx person, such as the term illustrated here, binabae, a Tagalog term used to describe individuals who possess both female and male traits. This is a term that resonated with me deeply as I came across it in my cataloging. To see the intersections of my identity in the language of my ancestors represented in the vocabulary and in the library catalog, I felt extremely validated, and it allowed me to feel like a real person in my gender and identity. And I think that other people can experience similar feelings thanks to Homosaurus and this project, and it would further inspire use of the library, the catalog, and future learning and exploration for individuals' identities and cultures.
Jules. So ultimately, Jules was able to recatalog 1,018 books. So that's 1,018 queer and trans resources that are now easier to access thanks to Homosaurus subject headings and the hard work of Jules. So here are just a couple examples of resources that we've now made more visible by the application of Homosaurus headings. And here's an image of what the subjects look like in library search, which is our discovery layer. So as you can see, they're clearly delineated from LC subject headings. So patrons are aware of where these terms are coming from. And like our other subject headings, clicking them will do a search for that heading. Conveniently, while we were working on this project, Ex Libris did announce that they would be adding Homosaurus as a controlled vocabulary in Alma. So this meant that we wouldn't need to manage the vocabulary on our own and could just let the system update when new releases of the vocabulary are made available. So that made work a lot easier for us. So to finish up, we're just going to close out our presentation with some of what we learned so that hopefully you can take these lessons and apply them at your own institutions.
So firstly, hire people with subject knowledge. I think that hiring people with subject knowledge makes a project like this run smoothly. I believe that my experience and knowledge as a queer person in the community aided me in knowing terms to search up in the Homosaurus, and knowing terms to use allowed me to complete the project with better understanding and ease. Secondly, working with the community. Working with the community is important for a project such as this because the purpose is to uplift community members, validate individuals, and make people feel like they have a voice in the library. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have been part of this because I was able to illuminate queerness and gender diversity in the catalog, allowing other community members to feel seen in the catalog and in the library as well.
And then kind of as I already mentioned, scoping was very important to make this project manageable. In an ideal world, we definitely would have worked on our entire collection, but that just would not have been feasible. In the time that we had Jules, we would have never made it through the entire collection. And it also would have forced them to rush through the work, which goes against our goals of creating thoughtful and respectful descriptions. It was also much easier to sell this project to administration with a scope that could be easily completed in a budgeted amount of time. Another point is to not automate the process. So as mentioned previously, one of the guiding documents for this project was the Trans Metadata Collective's best practices for trans and gender diverse resources. And an important point that they make is that this should not be an automated process for a number of reasons. Firstly, the broad nature of certain LCSH terms means that several identities could be contained under one umbrella term. So for example, sexual minorities, as already mentioned. Without the book in hand and being able to think through the work, a computer is not going to be able to understand what identities sexual minorities is supposed to imply. Another key point is that, as discussed already, these materials have historically not been cataloged to the fullest extent in order to identify the people therefore and about. So it's hard to automate the process when you can't even make those connections to begin with. And then lastly, I will just say that you want to prepare for not having someone around who is actively cataloging or working on these titles, and to work with them to come up with documentation so that in the future at your institution, catalogers have some guidance and are able to apply correct and respectful terms to new materials that come across their desk. So in conclusion, the Homosaurus has provided us with the opportunity to make materials for and about queer people more readily accessible to them and in a way that's respectful and does not obscure any information. We hope that everyone here will be able to take this knowledge back with them to their institutions and advocate for the use of Homosaurus or really any subject vocabulary that treats its subjects with care and compassion. Thank you.